it's Ellie Masters, and I hope you're enjoying this free audio exclusive of Rescuing Melissa, a spine-tingling thriller and steamy romance, all rolled into one.
JEM Publishing presents the unabridged recording of Rescuing Melissa, The Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1, written by Ellie Masters, narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes. 61. A Tunnel. Melissa. Melissa's lunatic ex-husband had one hand wrapped around her waist, the other held a knife to her throat. The cold metal edge of the knife pressed against her fragile skin. She squeezed her eyes shut, not sure what scared her more, that he would slip and fall, killing her, or that he wouldn't, and this horrible moment would never end. The door slid closed, taking the light with it. Dank, musty smells filled her nostrils, cloying in her mouth. The air reeked of death. Her death.
"There's a switch to your right."
Pierce called out.
"Where?" "Stretch your arm out. You'll feel it about waist-high." "Don't try anything stupid."
Scott increased the pressure of the knife against her throat. The rough sound of his fingers sliding against stone scratched in her ears. With the flick of a switch, light flooded her world with the steady illumination of yellow incandescence. Pierce reached into a pocket and retrieved a set of handcuffs.
"I'm going to cuff my queen."
A trickle of blood pooled at the hollow of her neck, turning sticky as it dried. She had no idea how deep Scott had cut, but she was still breathing, still alive. The pinch of pain across her throat helped focus her thoughts. Pierce grabbed her hand, yanking her arm behind her back. Before she could think, he had both of her hands cuffed. His breath heated her neck.
"You'll pay for your disobedience, my queen. Don't think for a minute you won't."
He punctuated each word with a short jerk on her wrist. She swallowed against the cry, struggling to get free. He didn't deserve her tears, but they flowed anyway. Nostrils flaring, he smelled her hair, then her neck. Her eyes widened, and a low whimper escaped her throat.
"So what the hell are we doing?"
Scott asked.
"What's your plan?" "Belle will meet us."
Pierce gestured down the dirt tunnel.
"This opens into a culvert at the back of my property where it backs up to the forest. She'll be there with the van. And then what? Contingency plans. You put a lot of trust in a slave."
Pierce shouldered past Scott, pushing Melissa ahead of him.
"You don't know Belle. Come. It's not far, but we need to hurry."
The faint yellow light cast dark shadows in front of them. The rough ground clawed at her feet, stubbing her toes, causing her to cry out. Pierce forced her forward, holding her when she stumbled, and pushed to keep her moving. Even though CJ was trapped in that horrible room, she had every faith he'd rescue her again. He wouldn't have let them take her if he didn't have a plan. Her eyes closed while she said a prayer. Pierce's firm grip held her up.
"Careful where you step,"
he cautioned. A shiver worked its way down her spine at the concern laced in his voice. Pierce had a whole different crazy going on. Whereas Scott was a murdering psychopath, Pierce believed he was the good guy. Darkness shrouded the tunnel as the light from the single bulb faded behind them. Melissa slowed, feeling her way forward with her toes. Pierce pressed against her back, his breath heavy on her neck, and his hand encouraging her forward with a gentle insistence.
"Just a little further, my queen. We're almost there."
She squinted against the dimness. Up ahead, shadows became more distinct, and the ceiling dropped. The mustiness of the tunnel intensified, tickling her nose into a sneeze. Her foot splashed in a puddle of water. Slick, she lost her footing and slipped, but Pierce protected her from injury.
"Careful."
He lifted and steadied her on her feet. Behind them, Scott's ragged breathing rattled in the darkness.
"How fucking long is this tunnel? Is the roof caving in?"
Her husband had never been fond of dark places.
"Not much further."
Pierce said.
"Shit. I can't see a thing." "The tunnel curves to the left."
He guided her by applying pressure to her back. Sure enough, the tunnel turned, and the ceiling dropped even lower until she hunched over and shuffled in the growing stream of water beneath her feet. Rock and slime turned to mud, which now squished beneath her feet. Thinking about what she was walking through was only slightly less nauseating than who followed her through the tunnel. The only positive was the faint light at the end of the tunnel. The dim glow brightened with each step, providing a radiance that bounced off the tunnel's rough-hewn rock. When she dared to look down, the muck at her feet glistened with a greenish cast. They came upon a grate with a lock. Pierce handed her to Scott.
There's a key I keep under the rock.
Pierce stooped to move a pile of rocks, tossing stones to the side in his search. Scott whispered in her ear,
I'm going to fuck you until you bleed. You'll watch as I kill him. Until death do us part, Melissa. Do you remember your vows?
A shudder shot down to the base of her spine. Should she warn Pierce? Pierce gave a grunt.
Found it.
A thick metal key scraped against a rock.
Your fucking slave had better be waiting outside.
Scott nipped at her ear and whispered,
You're going to watch while I kill them both. Belle will be there.
Pierce affirmed. His confidence seemed unflappable in the faith he placed in that crazy girl. Melissa's heart slammed against her ribcage and her pulse roared in her ears. She didn't want to die. The lock clicked open, and after a lot of squealing and rusting metal, Pierce forced the grate open. He retrieved Melissa and then led her out into a concrete culvert. Less than 100 feet away, his white florist's van waited. Standing next to the van, Belle shifted foot to foot. She cast her gaze up and down a dirt road and glanced down the culvert. Belle fell to her knees when she saw them, pressing her head to the ground in supplication. Pierce looked over his shoulder and caught Scott's eyes.
I told you she'd be there.
Scott sniffed. Once they put Melissa inside the van, she'd never be free. Her feet dug in, refusing to move. Pierce pushed against her back, but she fought him until he spun her around and lifted her onto his shoulders. He breathed easily, unconcerned with her weight.
We're almost there. About fucking time,
Scott said. In less than 100 feet, they would arrive at the van. Death waited for her there. CJ, I really need a hero.
62. Devil's Dance. Pierce. I would kill Scott Patterson. He was a fool and deserved a slow death. A cancer I needed cut out of my life. He brought a host of holy crap into my lap and cost me the perfect kingdom. In the blink of an eye, that bastard destroyed everything. Didn't he get the hint when I tossed my queen over my shoulders and shifted into a jog? I'd been learning from him for years. You'd think he'd follow my lead for once. But no. The bastard lumbered behind, no urgency to his step at all. The fool still had the damn knife out. I gave him a gun. Why wasn't he using it? But then I shoved my gun down next to the blade when I lifted my queen over my shoulder. She didn't put up much of a fight. The only reason I carried her was that I didn't want her thinking about running. Scott should pay better attention to what might happen and plan more than the next step ahead. We were so fucking vulnerable out here. Unlikely anyone would see us, but in a neighborhood like this, some bored housewife could be out for a jog. We would attract attention and be even more fucked than we were now. My plan was to load my queen in the back of the van, drive, kill Scott, dump his worthless flesh the first moment possible. Do you think I'd ever thought to admire this lunatic? Damn it, I couldn't kill him. Too messy, too likely to be traced back to me. I would tie him up at a filling station or rest stop and call the cops. They'd take him back into custody where he would spill every detail of what I've done. Shit! He may think he taught me everything I know, but Scott had a lot to learn. The first would be how to die. At least my queen remained blissfully quiet. The shock of the past few moments had to be seeping into her head. She knew her punishment would be severe. It was good her mind turned to such things. Discipline wasn't something I could hold back. but I could reward her for silence. The sooner she learned this simple fact, the easier her life would be. My heart broke with a glance toward my beautiful and obedient Belle. She did everything I'd asked, and even kept the engine running, something I hadn't instructed her to do. God, I loved her perfection. As we approached, she lifted her head.
Master.
That one word was a breath of beauty in my ears. Belle, you have pleased me. She kept her gaze focused on my feet. Up, I said. As she stood, I granted her my touch, placing my hand on her head so she could feel my mastery. Behind me, Scott scrambled out of the culvert. His breathing labored with the exertion. I'd hiked out of there carrying my queen and had barely broken a sweat. We gonna stand here all day? Scott looked down the road. I turned away because I couldn't hide the disgust on my face. Soon I would be rid of him. Belle, I commanded, open the back and climb inside.
Yes, master,
Came her soft-spoken reply. My blood warmed at the sweet whisper of her words, and my cock twitched. Belle walked around to the back of the van. Scott and I followed. Our heads were on swivels, scanning the streets. We were in the clear. Belle's scream had me twisting with surprise. A dark shape barreled into my shoulder, knocking me to the ground. My queen landed with a thump underneath me. She screamed. Another blur moved to my right. Muscle smacked on flesh. More screams issued from Belle. Something rolled me, moved me off my queen. Son of a bitch! Scott added his screech to this new threat. My ears rang and my head throbbed. Fists smacked something solid to my left. Cursing sounded over my shoulder. Face down, I struggled against a knee pressed to my spine. My left arm was wrenched behind my back. My attacker grabbed for the other. A keening sound came from Belle. I had never heard such a strangled cry out of her in all our years together. Out of my periphery, she launched through the air, knocking my attacker off my back. Feral sounds emanated from her throat.
Get off my master!
She kicked a man who had a scar traveling from his ear to his jaw. In their struggle, she dislodged a gun from his hand. The weapon went sailing through the air to land 10 feet away. Who the hell were these guys? I rolled to the side. Belle was a wildcat, all hissing and spitting. So damn beautiful. She gave me exactly the distraction I needed to get free. I spared a glance to my right. My queen dragged herself away, hand pressed to her knee. Her brows pulled together and her forehead creased with pain. A fist connected with my jaw, bringing my attention back to the man with the scar. He tossed Belle off his back, but she was already lifting herself off the ground and attacking again. As she flew at him, I rolled to my feet, a little unsteady, but prepared to defend or attack. Belle was on his back, biting his shoulder. He struggled to remove her. To my left, Scott faced off against another man who raised the barrel of his gun. Scott leaped forward, swinging with his knife and ignoring the gun. A shot fired, but Scott's momentum propelled him forward. He sliced across his attacker's forearm, wresting the gun from the man's hand. I couldn't spare any more of my attention for Scott. I turned back to the scarred man in front of me, who had been disarmed thanks to Belle. He peeled Belle off his back and slammed her to the dirt. She landed with a thud and scrambled back to her feet. I didn't have time for this. I pulled out the gun I'd taken from the fools locked in my dungeon, pointed, and pulled the trigger. Nothing. I pulled the trigger again. Nothing. The damn thing was a dud. I tossed the pistol and reached for my knife. "Belle, get his gun!" I lunged with my knife, intending to make quick work of him. He sidestepped, leaving me slashing at the air. Using my momentum, I pivoted and readied for another strike. I jabbed in a downward arc, and was rewarded with a hiss and a stripe of crimson over the man's bicep. I thrust my knife forward, but he caught my wrist, twisted it. Pain shot through my arm, but I wasn't releasing that knife. I stepped forward. The bastard wasn't expecting that, and I head-butted him. Our skulls connected with a crack. He released my wrist, and we faced off, me with my knife and him with bare hands. To my left, Scott aimed the gun he'd taken from his opponent, but nothing happened when he fired. What was up with the guns? He did what I had done, fired again, but when the gun failed, he threw it over his shoulder with a snarl. He came at his opponent in a furious whirl. I'd been worried about Scott, but there seemed to be no need. Perhaps I'd misjudged Scott's skill with a knife. My fears assuaged, I focused on the asshole before me. A tall man, his muscular frame climbed from here to forever. He had more muscle than me, but I was faster, with a longer reach. We lined up and prepared for the devil's dance.
63. A Hero. Melissa. Something popped inside Melissa's knee, sending shards of pain shooting through her leg. She crawled away from the mayhem, a nearly impossible task with an injured leg and hands cuffed behind her back. Still, she managed to find a place of safety against the left side of the van. When she was far enough from the fighting, she wiggled her good leg through her cuffed hands. Biting against the pain, she stretched to get the cuffs around her injured leg, thanking long hours of yoga practice for excellent flexibility. With her arms now to the front, she pulled herself up to the driver's side door. The effort exhausted her, and she leaned against the van, panting with exertion. She tried to leverage herself to standing, but a brief test of her leg found her knee buckling beneath her weight. Behind the van, the men fought. She spared a quick glance. Scott and Pierce had knives. Pierce's opponent parried with bare hands, while the other man faced off against Scott with a wicked blade of his own. Scott's face had lost all his sophisticated elegance. His enraged visage, feral and wild, was not something she would ever forget. He and his opponent circled, each man looking for an opening to attack. Their steps brought Scott closer to where she cowered against the van. With her hands clutching the side mirror, Melissa forced herself to balance her weight on one foot. She couldn't undo the cuffs. They were locked tight, but she didn't need her hands free to drive. Those men, whoever they were, had to be with CJ. He wouldn't have let Scott take her if he hadn't had a backup plan. Was CJ still trapped in that hellhole? Scott's knife slashed. Droplets of blood spattered. The man fighting her ex-husband cursed, and a stripe of red bloomed on his shredded shirt. He came at Scott with a swipe of his blade cutting into Scott's arm. Scott staggered back. Scott lunged, driving his opponent back with a thrust. But he aimed too high. His knife hovered in front of his opponent's face, his wrist captured in the grip of his opponent. Melissa grabbed the door handle, intent on climbing inside and away from Scott, but a mass of flailing arms came at her. Belle pulled her to the ground. "No, you belong to him! You serve him!" Belle's brand of crazy filled the air. She kicked and spat and clawed at Melissa's face. "Get off me!" She slapped at Belle. Belle flipped Melissa onto her stomach, and a shock of pain lit her knee on fire. "You will not run!" Wildly insane eyes blinked at Melissa. With her good leg, she kicked, connecting with Belle's gut. Pierce's slave doubled over, clutching at her belly. Melissa kicked a second, and then a third time, scooting herself further from the psychotic woman and moving away from the van, closer to where the men fought. And then she saw him. CJ sprinted across the field with Mac and Jenny by his side. How had they escaped that dungeon? Melissa bit her lower lip and swallowed an excited cry. A fist caught her jaw, swinging her head to the right. Stars filled her vision. Belle was back on her, kicking, screeching, and scratching again. With a curse, she defended against the madwoman. Her knee throbbed, the pain making her want to retch. All fists and arms, she couldn't throw Belle off, and with her hands bound, it was impossible to restrain the raving lunatic. Grunts sounded to her left. Flashes of steel glinted in the fading light of early dusk. Belle straddled Melissa, holding one hand on her wrists and the other pressing into her wounded knee. Melissa screamed. "Do not move." Belle's eyes danced with madness. Melissa stopped resisting and panted against the pain. Belle's hand eased up on her knee. Pierce danced with his opponent, circling. Scott did the same. CJ scrambled for one of the discarded guns.
Don't move.
Pierce laughed.
Go ahead. That damn thing doesn't work. Ever heard of an RFID trigger lock, asswipe?
A surge of strength flowed through Melissa. She didn't understand what a trigger lock was, but she didn't care. Belle's mouth gaped and she shifted her weight as if intending to run at CJ. Melissa took advantage of Belle's distraction and bucked Belle off her stomach. Belle launched forward and hit her head on the edge of a sharp rock. A loud crack sounded, and Belle didn't move. CJ's eyes hardened. He leveled his gun at Scott, who took a step back.
It's over,
CJ said. The chaos of the battle quieted with a sudden and profound hush. Pierce froze. His knife raised before him. Scott's chest heaved from his exertion, blood dripping from his blade. More seeped out of the gashes across his chest. Melissa's vision sharpened. Breath eased into her chest, no longer constricted by fear. Strength followed. The clamoring of her heart stilled, replaced by a steady beat. This horrible nightmare was over. Max searched the ground and retrieved his gun. He aimed at Scott. No one moved.
Drop your weapons,
CJ ordered with a flick of his gun.
Kick them away.
Pierce glanced at Scott, his vision dark and ominous.
This is all your fault.
Scott glanced at his hand, his brows drawing close. He made a move as if to drop his knife, but then he lunged toward Melissa. CJ fired his weapon. The shot blasted her eardrums. Scott took a step back, his face set in a frozen mask. His chin dipped down to stare at a widening stain on his chest. His eyes seemed frozen with surprise. And then he crumpled to the ground. She should have felt something. Some relief in his death. But she felt numb and distant. Less than 3 feet away, Scott's soulless eyes stared unblinking and dead into the sky. Pierce worked his jaw side to side, his fingers clenching the grip of his knife. CJ turned his weapon on Pierce.
Cuff him, Brett.
He tossed a pair of cuffs in the air. The man Pierce had been fighting snagged the cuffs.
Drop that knife.
Pierce glanced at Melissa, his eyes soft and round. His gaze cut to the unmoving form of Belle. His Adam's apple bobbed with his swallow.
You were always meant for me, my queen. We would have been great together. I would have served you well.
He sighed.
We will meet again.
Brett lunged as Pierce sliced across his throat. A red fountain bubbled up and spurted down the front of his chest. He landed in a sprawl of limbs on the dirt. CJ ran to Melissa, his breathing smooth and easy. Her ears still rang from the gunshot.
Are you okay?
He asked. I will be. Her entire body shuddered. She gripped his hand. CJ cupped her cheek. The warmth of his fingers soothed her and eased her breathing. He wrapped his hand around her waist and pulled her close. You saved me, she said.
I thought I'd lost you.
He tangled his fingers in her hair.
Are you hurt?
She couldn't answer, because in the next breath his lips found hers. The horror of the past moments fled in the heat of his touch, and the press of his mouth against hers. He pulled back, their lips lightly brushing, and then he yanked her against him. Desperate, hungry, needful. She needed more. With a sigh, she parted her lips and welcomed the taste of him. He broke off the kiss and pressed his brow against hers, tangling his fingers in her hair. He breathed out a sigh.
Never do that again.
Do what?
Leave.
Bright lights flashed down the road. She squinted against the glare. Mac's shadow fell over them.
Sam's arrived,
He said.
He's a bit late.
CJ huffed a laugh.
You think he's going to be pissed? If he doesn't fire your ass, I'll be surprised.
Mac's smile twisted.
Yeah, but you and I both know he won't.
He jerked his chin toward the van.
Crazy chick is knocked out cold but breathing.
3 black SUVs skidded to a stop, tires crunching against the gravel. Their headlights blinded her until she looked away. Men spilled out of the vehicles, and deep voices shouted commands. Mac went to greet the newcomers, his deep timbre filling the night with a recap of the scene. A stranger approached, swinging a flashlight. He shined the light at CJ. Early 50s, with a face scarred by acne, his expression was dark and stormy.
Never fucking listen, do you?
He said.
Late to the party again, Sam?
CJ teased.
Ma'am.
He tipped the brim of his hat.
You must be Melissa.
Melissa swallowed, unable to find her voice, but she managed the slightest nod.
Found Charlie at the house. We're calling a victim's response unit.
He glanced around.
What a fucking shitstorm the paperwork on this one is going to be.
CJ rocked her, and she relaxed. Within the fortress of his arms, she felt safe, the nightmare at an end. Scott was dead. He could no longer hurt her. A weight lifted off her shoulders, and she curled into CJ's embrace. 64. An ending. Melissa. The events following her rescue blurred in Melissa's mind. All the women in Pierce's dungeon were taken to St. John's Community Hospital, where they were examined, treated for their injuries, and met with specialists from a victim's response unit. While their physical wounds would heal with time, many of the psychological scars would likely persist for a lifetime. The last time she'd been to this hospital, CJ carried her in his arms. He was with her this time, too, overprotective, and refused to be separated during the ride in the back of the ambulance. He greeted the doctor at the emergency department with some familiarity and asked about a dog. Melissa didn't understand, except the dog had pulled through, and a baby and his mother were doing well. It was morning, and her knee had been wrapped in a brace. She had an MRI with an orthopedic visit scheduled in a week. There was concern about a tear of one of the ligaments, but it wasn't anything that would keep her in the hospital. Fortunately, her injuries were limited to her knee. The same could not be said for the other women. The woman Pierce had called Gretel went to surgery and was recovering in intensive care. All the other women were admitted to the general medicine ward, where they were being tended to by a team of psychiatrists and internal medicine physicians. CJ stayed with her, refusing to leave after visiting hours ended. He spent the night by her side, holding her hand and soothing her when nightmares brought her screaming awake. Her pulse went ballistic and triggered the alarms on the monitors, but he soothed her fears.
How do you feel?
CJ pressed his lips against her forehead. He finger-combed her hair, straightening out the knotted mess. I'm so tired. And scared. She was deathly afraid of going home, but where else could she go?
Hey,
he said.
Don't worry. We'll sort everything out together.
The deep tone of his voice pulled her from her concerns. Together? It's just... She felt incredibly lost, but free at the same time, as if that made any sense. With Scott's death, a huge weight felt like it had been lifted from her shoulders, and she made a decision. She didn't want to live in this town anymore. She definitely never wanted to go back to her house. Sell it or burn it, she would never step foot back in the house where Scott killed his last victim. But where would she go?
Shh.
He said.
Let me help.
He placed a finger over her lips. She didn't know how he could help. He had a life to get back to, and her life was a mess. They barely knew each other, although it felt as if she'd known him forever. They connected on a level she didn't understand. But with everything that happened, she didn't want to think about letting him go. The nurse came into the room, interrupting their conversation, and went over Melissa's discharge instructions. CJ took the papers and tucked them into a pocket of his jacket. Do you have any questions? The nurse asked. No. Thank you for everything. Melissa had spent too much time in hospitals and was ready to go. You have our number if any questions come up. You're good to go, Miss Evans. You can leave at any time. Melissa took in a breath.
You ready?
CJ asked. Melissa adjusted the straps of her leg brace and grabbed the crutches she'd been provided. I'm more than ready. But if you don't mind, I want to check in with Henrietta. She'd never forget Henrietta's strength. They didn't know each other, but had bonded in that dungeon. Melissa needed to make sure Henrietta was going to be okay, and wanted to make sure they had each other's contact information. CJ's phone buzzed. Whatever he read on the text brought a smile to his face.
I think that would be perfect,
He said.
There's something I need to do. Do you mind if I slip away for a bit and meet you at her room?
His consideration for her feelings astounded Melissa, as if he understood she needed time with Henrietta alone. That would be great, she said. He hovered beside her while she worked her way down to Henrietta's room. After a quick check with Henrietta, CJ excused himself. Melissa gave Henrietta a hug. Hey. Henrietta's smile came slowly. Hi. Any idea when they're going to let you go home? She knew Henrietta had 2 girls waiting for her, and couldn't imagine the worry her new friend had for her daughter's well-being. They have a few more tests, I think. Did you talk with the psychologists yet? I did. They're coming back later, but I'm hoping I'll be discharged tomorrow. Henrietta clasped her hands and brought them to her chest. You're going to be okay. Melissa placed her hand over Henrietta's. I know. My dreams, they'll fade with time. Melissa understood about the nightmares. A soft knock sounded on the door. CJ peeked his head inside.
Mrs. Jones?
Yes? A broad smile filled his face and made him look even more devastatingly handsome. Oddly, the twinkle in his eyes wasn't for Melissa, but for the woman lying in the hospital bed.
I have a surprise.
Mr. CJ, a small voice screeched. I want to see the surprise. Henrietta gasped, and her eyes teared up. A little girl barreled into the room, and then she stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening with shock, and her mouth gaping wide. Mama! The little girl launched herself at the bed and crawled on top of Henrietta. Anna! Another girl, a little older, poked her head around the door. Her eyes widened, and she tugged on the front of her shirt. Mama? Angela, come here! Henrietta gestured the girl forward. Angela's eyes watered. She closed the distance slowly and climbed into the bed beside her sister. The 3 of them hugged and kissed and cried. Melissa took a step toward the door, wanting to give them space.
Come, let's let them get reacquainted.
CJ's arms wrapped around Melissa's waist, and he whispered in her ear. Melissa waved to Henrietta and gestured for her to call her later. As they left the room, CJ swept her into his arms, scooping her crutches into his grasp.
How about we make this official, Miss Melissa Evans?
Official?
How about a first date?
First date? She laughed. CJ, we've kind of moved past first date territory. She'd never think about a shower this same way with CJ around. That clinical and traumatic event had turned into the most unforgettable experience of her life.
I want a first date and take my girl out in style.
His eyes crinkled with mirth. Perhaps he'd been thinking about that night, too.
All this
He made a vague gesture.
is not the way I like to woo a woman.
Woo me? Melissa laughed. Careful. You're dangerously close to stepping back into the nun zone.
Hey, I'm trying to be serious here.
By the look in his eyes, she knew that to be the truth. His stubble tickled her finger as she traced the angle of his jaw. Well, you can start by apologizing.
Apologizing?
For calling me a drowned rat.
I'll never apologize for that.
CJ threw his head back and roared with laughter. Well, then you'd better find a way to impress me.
How about we take a trip across the country? I'm thinking a few weeks to drive, take in the sights.
A cross-country trip as a first date? That's a bit unconventional.
And yet perfect. I want to show you my home, and some place that's a bit unconventional, but might make the perfect place for you to recover after all of this.
Recover?
Wrong word?
No, recover is the right word. I guess I thought... Are you saying... Do you want... She couldn't get her words out, too afraid to voice what she wanted from him.
Wow, that's painful to listen to. Let me save you from tripping all over your words.
I wasn't tripping over my words.
You totally were.
He tapped the tip of her nose.
Let me make this really easy. I'm not ready to let you go. I like you. I like you. And I want you in my life if you'll have me. But my life is with the Guardians, and we're headquartered in Northern California, just below Monterey. I don't know if anything is holding you here, but I'm hoping a little vacation away from here is something you'd consider. I'd also like to get to know you better. You know, without all the kidnapping stuff going on. I want time with just you alone with me. And I want to show you a place I think can really help you after all this mess.
A place?
Yes, a place. We call it the facility.
The facility? Not a very original name.
Not really, but it's amazing. It's a place for people we help to receive the services they need to recover. It also helps them develop the life skills they need to move on. It's free. You can stay as long as you like. I'm literally right across the street. I mean, you can stay with me. I'd love it if you stayed with me, but I don't want to put too much pressure on the living together thing, considering we haven't officially had a first date yet.
Is that so?
I'm serious, Melissa. I want to get to know you better. By whatever twist of fate, you and we're meant to be together.
A smile filled his face, and his eyes twinkled with mirth.
But not in a creepy psycho killer kind of way.
Definitely not in a creepy psycho killer kind of way. She couldn't help it. She laughed, and like magic, her laughter unloaded the miasma which still clung to her after the ordeal with Pierce and Scott. So you're asking me out on a first date, which is to drive across the country and shack up with you at the other end? He locked eyes with hers and dipped his head. His exhales washed over her, searing her skin with the heat of his desire. There was a tingle in her breath and a hitch in her chest as her entire body became painfully aware of his presence. His bulging biceps held her. His powerful shoulders supported her. Every inch of this wonderful man protected her. He was her hero. He rescued her from a deadly tornado and from the unimaginable evil of Pierce and her dead ex-husband. In CJ's stare, he promised much more. He promised to give her his heart.
Is that a yes, Miss Evans?
Yes. She looped her arms around his neck. Most definitely yes. He seized her with a kiss. There was nothing tender as he claimed her with his possession. His desire for her, his bruising aggression, pushed past her fears, obliterating them in the grinding of their lips. Fate twisted their lives together, and she wanted to find out what would happen next. It looked like CJ wanted that too, and she couldn't wait for their official first date to begin.
Hello, this is Ellie Masters, and I hope you enjoyed CJ and Melissa's story. This free audio exclusive of Rescuing Melissa is the first book in my Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialist series, a spine-tingling thriller and steamy romance, all rolled into one. I like to think of it as Romantic Suspense meets Silence of the Lambs. We've made it through all the chapters, and while the worst of the worst happened, CJ and the Guardian swooped in and saved the day. I'm proud to say that Melissa helped save herself as well. Now, who knows if I'll put up another audiobook on YouTube. Make sure you like and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to tap the bell. You'll be notified if a new audiobook is posted for your audio reading enjoyment. And if you're enjoying this story, please share it with your reading buddies, and let me know what you think in the comments. And while waiting for more, you can check me out at elliemasters.com, and you can find all my books at elliemasters.com/Amazon. If you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber, you can read all my books for free. Until next time, this is Ellie Masters bringing you the best of romantic suspense.
We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of Rescuing Melissa, the Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1. Written by Ellie Masters, narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes.